Welcome to the Law and Liberty Podcast. I'm your host, James Patterson. Law and Liberty is an online magazine featuring serious commentary on law, policy, books, and culture, and formed by a commitment to a society of free and responsible people living under the rule of law. Law and Liberty in this podcast are published by Liberty Fund. Hello, and welcome to the Law and Liberty Podcast. I'm James Patterson. Today is Thursday, October 3rd, 2024. Today we have a panel of three guests to talk about fusionism, what it is, where it came from, what its future might be. Our first panelist is Charles C.W. Cooke. Mr. Cooke is a senior editor at National Review and the host of the Charles C.W. Cooke Podcast. He's the author of the 2016 book, The Conservatarian Manifesto, and is a roller coaster enthusiast. Our next panelist is Stephanie Slade. Slade is a senior editor at Reason Magazine and fellow in liberal studies at the After Institute. In 2013, she was a finalist for the Bastiat Prize for Journalism. And in 2016, she was selected to the Robert Novak Journalism Fellowship at the Fund for American Studies. She's currently writing a book on fusionism and is a chartreuse enthusiast. Finally, our third panelist is Dr. Samuel Goldman. Dr. Samuel Goldman is an associate professor of political science at George Washington University, where he is also executive director of the John L. Loeb Jr. Institute for Religious Freedom and the director of the Politics and Values Program. His work includes his 2018 God's Country, Christian Zionism in America, and the 2021 After Nationalism. He is the editor of Fusion, an online publication with the American Institute of Economic Research, and he is a sartorial enthusiast. Welcome to the podcast, all of you.
Thank you.
Thanks, James.
Okay, so this format's pretty simple. I'll just ask one of you a question, and the other two can provide your insights, disagreements, or amendments as you wish. I'm actually going to start with Slade, since she is writing a book on fusionism. I figured she'd be the right person to ask for a definition. So what is fusionism, Stephanie?
Okay, so this is a great question and a hard question, and it's very possible that you have three guests on this show and we each would define it differently. I think the way that the word tends to be used in American politics these days is as a description of something that we saw during the Cold War years, and especially during the run-up to the Reagan Revolution, which was a coalition that formed on the right of center in America between social conservatives, economic libertarians, and defense hawks. That's the way people often will tend to use the word fusion. It was a fusion of these different groups that came together and formed an alliance in order to elect Ronald Reagan. And they were united by their sort of the fact that they had a common enemy in global communism in the Soviet Union. Okay, that's the way it tends to be used, I think, these days. I don't like that definition. I think it's ahistorical, and I'm trying to revive what I think is a better, more correct understanding of the word fusionism, which is that it was originally coined to describe the writing and the thinking of a guy named Frank Meyer, who worked at National Review magazine in the 50s and 60s and early 70s. And what he said was, what he meant by fusionism was that there was liberty and virtue are both necessary to human flourishing. A good society must be free and it must be virtuous. And so conservatives in the American context must be willing to defend both liberty and virtue. That means that they need to bring these streams of thinking, these traditions, libertarianism or classical liberalism, and religious traditionalism together into what it means to be a conservative, again, in the American context. So it was a philosophical synthesis. It said, basically, you should care about both these things. You can't just have one or the other. We can't just defend one or the other, liberty or virtue. You can't be just a libertarian who never thinks about what is freedom for. Freedom is for virtue. But you also can't be what we see sometimes on the new right these days, which is wanting to use the power of the state to enforce virtue on people. That doesn't make sense either. You need liberty in order to have virtue and vice versa. So it's a philosophical synthesis. And that's the understanding of fusionism that I'm interested in and that I'm trying to revive with my work.
Sam, Charlie?
I'm always tempted to give long-winded professorial answers. So I will defer to Charlie to give a pithy and helpful answer, and then I'll drone on for several minutes.
Okay.
Well, I would broadly agree with that. I just have a couple of other ways, certainly, that I look at this. One is that I see the fusionist project as being an inevitable coalition of people who don't believe in new Soviet man. In other words, although they differ in their attitude towards the state and perhaps their political preferences, they are allergic to the idea that human nature can be improved. And I think in that sense, the fusionist movement, if you can call it that in American history, has in some ways been a negative movement. I don't mean it's been negative for America, but I mean it has been a movement filled with people who don't like the progressive perception of human beings and therefore of government, because they don't believe you can affect man and create utopia. And then within that, you have these two strands. I think liberty and virtue is obviously key. But the other way I would look at it is you have these two strands that have different approaches to Chesterton's fence, right? So if there is a limit to conservatism, it's that it can sometimes just hold on to things for too long because they are there. And sometimes they need the libertarians to say, you're wrong. Change is necessary or the circumstances have been altered. But then simultaneously, you have the libertarian problem that I see, which is this desire. I think I stole this from Dan Foster, who used to write for National Review. This desire to try and work out all of human nature on a napkin. There's a mathematical way of looking at the world that actually doesn't have as much to offer as experience. And so you often need the conservatives to say to those people, no, this doesn't work. Again, where they are similar is that they just do not think in that Wilsonian model that if you elect the right people who are more evolved than everyone else, they will push us into sunlit uplands because we're not actually much different than the Romans.
So Charlie, you're not originally from the United States. Some people might detect that in the accent. But you came to the United States. Not only did you become an American citizen, I wrote down you became the most American citizen, a Floridian, right?
Right.
Do you consider fusionism something uniquely American, or did you see it at home or maybe elsewhere in Europe?
I think it is much more American than anything else because America has been better at preserving its classical liberal tradition. And conservatism in America, and this is its own book, right? But conservatism in America is still hews to that 18th century worldview that has largely disappeared in Britain. I mean, there are still remnants of it in Britain. There are still a few habits, but it's just not the way that people talk. And in the US, it's interesting with the election coming up that everyone involved is trying to cast themselves as the leave you alone, freedom-loving person in the room, even when it's not true. And that is just not, for example, what's happening in Britain right now. That's not what happened in the last election in the slightest. It's certainly not what you would see in France or Italy or Germany, God forbid. So, yeah, I think you can't really have, at least in my conception of fusionism, I think this may be true of Stephanie's as well, you can't really have a fusionist project without classical liberalism. And because America has preserved that better than most, this is where it thrives.
Okay, now can I say something long-winded and pedantic?
Yes, we're welcome to you onto the podcast for exactly that reason, Sam.
Okay, so again, I sort of broadly agree, but I would offer a few variations, if not quibbles. And the first is that for me, fusionism is less a synthesis or doctrine than a productive tension. And I'm sure that we will get to later in the conversation some of the shortcomings of fusionism or fusionism as it has been understood recently. I think this is one of them. It's not a set of conclusions that everyone who considers themselves a conservative or an American conservative needs to agree on. Rather, it is the product of disagreement within certain shared parameters. And I think when it's understood in that sense, fusionism may be a little bit healthier than people sometimes assume. The second is that I would probably emphasize Meyer himself less than Stephanie does. Meyer did popularize this idea, although he himself did not coin or particularly like the term fusionism. But as he was very clear about saying, this was not something that he was thinking out. He was trying to identify and articulate a tendency in American and Western political traditions that long preceded him and that he hoped would continue beyond him. And that, too, I think, is one of the challenges when discussing fusionism. People tend to look at Meyer and look for chapter and verse. That's not a bad place to start, but I think that's more a way of raising questions than answers. Finally, as for classical liberalism, obviously that is in itself a controversial term, and it can be defined in various ways. But one of Meyer's arguments, which is connected with his attempt to locate this way of thinking in Western civilization, extending back to the ancient Greeks and even to the biblical tradition, is to say that fusionism, or the Western tradition of liberty, is older than what we now call liberalism. And in fact, he argued that what came to be described as liberalism roughly in the 19th century was an element of that tradition, but it was a somewhat distorted or limited version of the tradition that brought freedom out of its productive tension with order and virtue. And he was trying to put that back in, so to speak.
So, Sam, as an editor for a fusionist publication, what do you make of the condition fusionism at present is? You mentioned that it is this sort of range of productive positions, right? A sort of agreed upon set of principles, differently arranged and emphasized. It would seem at the moment it's not doing great. And is this because historical conditions in which fusionism emerged as a kind of expression of conservatism have vanished? Does that mean that eventually fusionism will too?
I think fusionism was in many ways a victim of its own success, with the apparent triumph of Reagan and the adoption of a sort of Reaganite rhetoric throughout the Republican Party, although the substance was often quite different. It seemed as if the questions had all been answered and everyone agreed. And that really wasn't true. There were a lot of latent disagreements that were submerged. And again, if you look back to Meyer's generation of intellectuals, they disagreed bitterly with each other. I mean, they really went after each other, and we think it's bad today on Twitter. But go back to some of the conversations in National Review or volumes to which Meyer and his contemporaries contributed. They disagreed a lot, and some of that disagreement disappeared, but also conditions changed. And even if Meyer and others were right about the continuity of the parameters, which I think is maybe a better term than principles, the solutions that were assumed to follow became stale and counterproductive and often boring. And I think it is natural and healthy that generated a response. That then leaves a task to those who think that Meyer was onto something without agreeing with everything he ever said, to find new and more plausible ways of articulating the parameters and to think about really what really follows from them, rather than reverting to formulas of the 1980s or 1990s, which perhaps made sense at the time, but don't respond directly to our problems today.
Either of you want to come to Meyer's defense? Maybe Slade?
Yeah, I don't know about coming to his defense, but I think there's some real truth to the idea. I mean, I actually think there's a lot of truth to the idea that fusionism has sort of faded away out of the conversation, and the connotations that it had 40 years ago have been almost completely lost today, in part because, it did seem like it was so successful. We had, reached the end of history. Liberalism in the, American liberal democratic capitalist sense had triumphed over, the global competitors. And so why do we need to sit around talking about why freedom is good anymore and why virtue is good anymore? Everybody sees that the alternatives are bad and they fail. And that just naturally happens. It wasn't like a poor decision that anybody made. I think that just is what follows from a success like that. So I don't think that's a bad way to think about why has this sort of been lost in recent years?
I mean, in a sense, this is a practical question. And one of the things that will cause people to differ on it is whether or not you think that the conclusions that the fusionist collection arrived at have disappeared. And I don't. I mean, I've actually written this for Law and Liberty before. I think there is a lot wrong with our politics. I think there's a lot wrong with the conservative movement. And I think there's a lot wrong with institutions that are supposed to reflect that as a 501c3 compliant definition. But I think that the precepts that started to be argued for and then adopted in the 1980s are much more intact than many others do on the right. I think that we only have to look at the big right of center states. I live in one, Florida. Another one is Texas. See what they do. I think we only have to look at what every other presidential administration does and their opponents pay lip service to. I think you only have to look at trade and the tax code and the total lack of price controls and the mockery of price controls in recent weeks to see that there is still a lot of that old religion still there. And so while I have a lot of time for the idea that you can't just take old prescriptions and say, this is what we're going to do now when the world has changed, I'm just less persuaded than many others that the fusionists have sort of lost. I think that one of the reasons it is less necessary to talk about this all the time is that there is still a large number of people who have internalized those ideas and made them what America is. And I think some of the people who would disagree with me also disagree on that first question, which is, well, are we now living in a completely different philosophical era?
The rise of the freedom conservatism sort of movement, the freedom conservatism manifesto that came out last year, I think is an example. I mean, it's evidence to support the idea that there are plenty of people out there who still buy into these ideas about liberty and virtue and classical liberalism rightly understood. I was at a conference recently and I was talking about how if you go to like the State Policy Network annual conference, which is where, people at free market think tanks in the 50 states come together to discuss the policies that they're working on, like on the ground in the conservative movement, outside of the sort of elite talking heads of DC or New York. They're all jazzed up about school choice and tax reform and deregulation and all the same kinds of policies that you would associate with Ronald Reagan, not with the sort of so-called nationalist populist new right of today.
Yeah, we're actually going to talk about the free con stuff here in a bit, hopefully. I did want to talk about these elite DC New York types, though. Slade, there's a lot of contesting alternatives, national conservatism and post-liberalism. These were kind of the same thing. Now they're kind of not the same thing. So, what are these? How are they maybe different from each other and from fusionism?
Well, and I would actually throw like the sort of neo-reactionary conservative strand into the picture as well. The way I talk about this often is that, we tend to think about politics in terms of a left-right spectrum, but there is this divide that runs sort of across both the left and the right, which is, for lack of a better term, liberalism, classical liberalism. I mean, maybe depending, you may not like that word, but like what I mean is if you believe in equal rights under the law for everybody, right? Limited government, individual freedom, rule of law, and hopefully, I think rightly would be free markets also. But you're on one side of this divide, and if you sort of reject those things, or if you're more skeptical of those things, you're on the other side of that divide. So on the other side, on the illiberal, anti-liberal side of the divide, the people who are saying we need to embrace muscular government to impose our values on society, you have a bunch of different strains and factions within the conservative movement, sometimes talked about as the new right or the illiberal right or the dissident right or whatever. one of the divides then is between the religious and the secular. So the neo-reactionaries tend to actually be anti-Christian, anti sort of Judeo-Christian heritage. Why? Because they don't believe that every individual person was created in the image of God and has sort of equal dignity and moral equality. They believe in like natural hierarchies. They think that the strong and the beautiful should rule over everyone else. And so there's a sort of secular, almost pagan quality to some of the folks on the dissident right.
But surely that means that we would be in charge, Stephanie. The strong and the beautiful.
That's why it's such an act of self-abnegation not to go along with their plans.
Yes. They didn't think that one all the way through, clearly. But then within the anti-liberal right, the dissident right, there's also the more religious or religious traditionalist strains. So the National Conservatives tend to believe, for example, that we should restore mandatory Bible reading to public schools. That is a position that Yoram Hazony has articulated. He's the sort of founder of the National Conservatism movement. And then the post-liberals or the Catholic integralists or some of the Christian nationalist types have similar views where they think that they're. In fact, I went to the National Conservatism Conference and this year, there was a whole panel on why separation of church and state has failed. And we need to just dispense with that whole idea. We need to have an integration we need to get church and state. The state should have an active role or the church should have an active role in how the state governs and vice versa. So these are illiberal or anti-liberal, or they're sort of, again, they're rejections, or at least moving away from the idea of limited government and individual liberty and equal rights under the law. One of the lines that I always repeat that the new right loves is the idea that we should be willing to use state power to reward our friends and punish our enemies. And I hate the idea, but I like to point out, sort of highlight that, because I think it's clearly a rejection of the idea of equal treatment under the law. Like, either you think the state should choose winners and losers and to decide who are the good guys and should, shower them with benefits and then punish the ones that they consider to be the bad guys, or you think the government should have a sort of more neutral role in adjudicating the law fairly and equally for all. So that's the divide that I think is worth emphasizing here, is that classically liberal and illiberal or anti-liberal. And there are all these strains and factions on the anti-liberal side, but they all, I think, more or less share that in common.
So, Charlie, your Conservatarian manifesto called for bolstering fiscal conservatism and maybe some moderation on culture war issues. And what we got was fiscal progressivism and a moderation on culture war issues. What happened?
Well, that is a partially correct description. That was, I think, one of the unfortunate side effects of the way the book was marketed, because it was at the time of gay marriage. It was published at the time of gay marriage. And my prediction, one of the few predictions that was correct, was that the conservative movement would abandon gay marriage as a cause, but not abortion, because they're just completely different issues. And one of them can be waved away with an appeal to liberalism. Why do you care? And probably would be, I thought, and it was, although I made a staunch case for religious liberty alongside that. And the abortion can't be, because if you believe it's taking a life, as I do, then you can't just say, well, who cares? And this is, of course, one of the silly things about some of the pro-choice rhetoric is mind your own business. Well, it's not you that I'm interested in. The question about fiscal conservatism is a great one. And in fact, I was in Dallas yesterday and I was talking to a group about exactly this. I think what happened was that all political actors in the United States recognized that it is just extremely detrimental to their chances of being elected to talk about it. If you go back to 2010, there was a bipartisan consensus that there was a problem with entitlements. Barack Obama said this. He had a meeting at which he said this. Now, he had different views as to how to fix it than others, but he would acknowledge the problem. In 2012, the vice presidential candidate for the Republican ticket was Paul Ryan, who had a plan to deal with the fiscal deficits that seemed to go on into the distance. It seemed reasonable when the book was written in 2014 to assume, given that both sides agreed there was a problem, that there would be a continuing effort to fix it, and it went away. And one of the most annoying things about this, from my perspective, is that when the press writes about this, they talk about the realization that talking about fiscal conservatism, at least in the sense of fixing the deficit and therefore starting to pay down the debt. They talk about it as if realizing that hurts you is a great genius move. They would say this back in 2016. They would say, well, of course, Trump figured it out. He figured out that he didn't need to talk about this because people hate it. Well, yeah, he did figure that out. That's absolutely true. That's correct. And he benefited from it, certainly. But that doesn't mean that it went away. And I suppose the short answer to the question is I actually overestimated the likelihood that we would get some statesmanship on this or on any other issue. Now, I'll just say one thing in my defense, because the book has a lot of different questions on it. There are a couple of things in the book I saw coming. One was the immigration really was going to become central, and that we were not going to do some, mass amnesty plan with the blessing of both parties. And another was the rise of an anti-war faction on the right, which I thought we were going to see some Taftism, some Senator Taftism, which we did. The fiscal conservatism side I got wrong, but I do think that it is extremely important for conservatives to hold on to it anyway, and more than they do. First off, because they're right. I mean, we are just coming up against this mountain of debt, this endless set of deficits. They aren't going to go away. We will survive for longer than most because we're the world's reserve currency. But that doesn't mean we can drive at the wall forever and not crash. But also because, to bring it back to fusionism, there are actually lots of voters in this country who are, at least in some sense, fiscally conservative. And they might not want to make the difficult trade-offs that are necessary. But the sort of NatCon approach to everything is just not that popular. And that's why I say I have a practical approach to this as much as anything, because I think fusionism is a practical exercise in coalition building as much as anything else. It's what you're trying to do with it is look at the country and say, well, who is broadly on our side? Who does not believe in utopia? Who thinks that liberty and virtue are important? Tradition is important. The rule of law is important. And then while there's that great tension that Sam described, try and bring them towards us. And I'm just not persuaded that we have lost that sense of fiscal conservatism. I think our politics has lost a lot of it, but I don't think the American public is quite as, although it's sort of hypocritical and confused on it, I don't think that it is anywhere near as hostile to it as the progressives or national conservatives would have you believe.
Slade, Sam, any response?
Yeah. So James, you and I have sparred a little bit over the idea of whether there is a realignment happening in this country. And I think that this is relevant here. I mean, okay, among white working class voters, but also Black and Hispanic voters, Trump gained vote share from 2016 to 2020. To me, this suggests that there is nothing in principle. I mean, one maybe conventional way to talk about this is, they liked the fact that he said, we're not going to take away your government goodies, right? We're going to keep spending money and throwing money at you, and we're not going to touch Medicare or Social Security or whatnot. I think that's not right. I think all the evidence suggests that they were being pushed away from the far left coalition by insane cultural positions coming from the left, and that these folks, again, working class, mostly, less educated, blue collar and even minority voters are actually more conservative on social and cultural issues than their white progressive allies. And so they were just like not buying what the far left was selling on these cultural issues. And that's what pushed them into the Republican camp. But, immigrants they start businesses at a higher rate than native born Americans, right? These working class folks, they disproportionately work in industrial sectors and in like energy production sectors that the left's regulatory policies make much harder to succeed. So there's lots of arguments, I think, that can be made for why a sort of free market, pro-trade, deregulatory economic, free market economic sort of program is actually better for the working class. And these types of voters that had long been considered to be, they've been lost to the other side, they could never come back. I don't think that's true. I think it's going to be maybe a battle to make the case for why these policies are better for you in the long run than, again, just endless government spending. But I think it's not like this fight has already been lost.
Yeah, I mean, thinking about the sort of practical political implications, like Charlie, I think the reason that we have not faced our fiscal problems is that because the dollar is the world's reserve currency, in effect, it seems like free money. And, it's very hard to turn down free money. I don't blame the American voter for embracing the flow of free money, as long as it really does seem to be free. And that's been the case for the last generation, roughly. But that probably won't be the case forever. And if, as I suspect, we are entering a period of fiscal constraint, that will make some of these sort of traditional arguments much more salient and I think much more convincing, interesting as it is to discuss them in the abstract. One place where economic policy really is real to people is inflation. And, if I were on the sort of national populist side, I would take a warning from the bitter and justified reaction of the public against the inflation of the Biden years. People hate inflation, and they will support just about anything that promises to reduce inflation. So, people in those circles have proposed radical restrictions on immigration, really sweeping tariffs, very expensive forms of industrial policy. I am not an economist, but economists say that is likely to raise prices. If those policies are implemented, and that's what happens, I think they will become very unpopular very quickly. So, to some extent, the argument about tariffs or trade in seminar rooms and on podcasts is just not all that relevant until the policies are attempted and until their effects become clear. I don't know how much real response there's likely to be. And, we've been talking about Reagan and others. It's not coincidental that Reagan reaches national political prominence and ultimately becomes president in a period of high inflation and fiscal constraint. That's the situation when these arguments seem like the answers that people need. And as long as that's not the case, and it seems that we can have free money to pay for entitlements and low inflation forever, the ideas will seem less appealing too. So, I'm always happy to have the discussions, but a big part of politics is being in the right place at the right time. And at least the last few years have not been the right time. That may be changing now.
Yeah, that's actually we'll have another question about that maybe. But before we get to that, Sam, I did want to ask you, as someone who's done work on political science and American religion, how much do you think the decline of fusionism has to do with the changing religious profile of the average American, but especially the one who tends to be self-identified conservative? We actually got a little bit of this from Slade before when she noted the division between the secular and religious reactionaries. Does that carry over into broader voting patterns or anything of the sort?
Well, just as I am not an economist, I am not an empirical political scientist. I was taught by my graduate school advisors to be evidence aware in my arguments, but not necessarily evidence based. So these suggestions are evidence aware, but not evidence based. And I think one difference between our situation and conditions in the 1960s or even the 1980s is that it was easier to assume at that time that there was sort of a religious, more or less socially conservative background culture that you could count on, and that in the absence of direct government intervention, most people in most places would do sort of the right things. That's much harder to assume now. I'm not saying that it's not true, but it's harder to assume. And I think that is where some of the critics of fusionism from the right have found their point of entry. You read Tocqueville about religion and civil society, and Meyer and National Review can appeal to the conservative majority. We don't live in that world in the same way anymore. And that makes radical interventions sound not just more appealing, but also more necessary. I mean, this is where people say, look where we're going. Unless we do something dramatic now, we will end up in 10 or 20 years where Europe is already. And even when I got into this business 20 or 25 years ago, that didn't seem to be the American trajectory the way it does now.
So, just a few minutes ago, we were talking about maybe changes in the conditions. Some of the ones that came up were the economic headwinds with issues like inflation and maybe the sort of fiscal cliff when it comes to economic entitlements. There are also the fact that there's a kind of formal, maybe informal, anti-American axis among several nations. We have ongoing conflicts in the Middle East that have reached kind of a fevered pitch, and widespread student radicalism and the rise of crime in major cities. It sounds like the 1970s. So where's the next Reagan, right? This might be a sign of fusionism's ascent, as Sam indicated before. Is this correct? And if so, where do you think it might have its constituencies? Slade?
Yeah. So after the 2016 election, I committed to never making a prediction about how an election would turn out or what might be coming in our political process on the record again, because I was just wrong about everything. So I don't know. I mean, the answer is, of course, I don't know what the future holds. I guess the main thing, I'll just keep this very short. The main thing that I try to emphasize always is that anybody who tells you that fusionism is dead, reports of the death are exaggerated, right? Like that this is a live conversation, that there are two live options before the sort of conservative movement still. And there are lots of people that are trying to pull the direction, the movement in these two different directions, the sort of, again, nationalist, populist, big government, conservative, muscular government sort of conservatism, and a more classically liberal fusionist direction. And I don't think that it's obvious to me which side is going to sort of triumph, or if we're going to sort of continue muddling along in this sort of weird in-between place. I hope not. That doesn't seem great either. But I don't know. It's a live debate. And I think it could go either way. And I agree with you that there are some of the conditions that, stagflation was part of why Reagan was successful, right? That's part of the story there. And so when economic policy, as Sam was just saying, when economic policies that are pushed by either the left or the new right are tried and shown not to work, that creates an opening. So I would not assume that just because right now most people talk about the big government conservatives as being on the ascent, that's going to be that way forever necessarily.
See, I think we're going to win because I think we're right. That's a prediction I'm happy to make. I don't know what's going to happen in this or that election, but I think we're right. Obviously everyone thinks his own opinions are right. So it would be odd for me to say, I think I'm wrong about everything. But I really don't consider the new right to be ascendant either. First off, because I think it has a horrible electoral record. I don't know why you would ever point to it and say that's the future. And it would be one thing if it were sweeping elections and yielding bad results and no one seemed to care. But neither of those things is true. It's not sweeping elections. It's not doing particularly well. And it's offering up ideas that have been proven over and over again not to work and that are, in fact, not working right now. So I am of the view that we are going to win. Now, the alternative to that is the United States completely collapses like Rome did and we all die. And that is an option. That is what happens if you don't get it right. But I don't think that's going to happen either, at least not yet. So I'm bullish on this. I really am bullish on it. It might take a while.
Yeah, I mean, sort of one way that I think Charlie is right about the anti-utopian character of fusionism is that it reminds us that we have to screw up. We make mistakes, and the best we can do is learn from our mistakes or respond to them. There's no sort of permanent solution that's stable forever. And when fusionism has gotten into trouble, it's because it has acquired a utopian character, as if one set of policies and institutions set up in just one way can survive and flourish always and under all conditions. That's a kind of utopian aspiration. And when that hasn't happened and real problems have emerged, again, I think it is healthy and normal and justified that there's been some resistance. At the same time, if we are right, and I agree with Charlie that we are, I think we are, those alternatives are not going to generate the goods that they promise. And I don't think that we need to wait centuries and millennia for that to happen. I think the results are fairly clear fairly quickly. And Charlie pointed out, and this is useful, we can talk about Adam Smith or Aristotle or Locke or whatever, and it's fun, but we can also look at the relative performance of different jurisdictions here in the United States and see who's doing well. And it is Florida, Texas, some of the other Sun Belt states that look in their political approach more or less fusionist, and there's a lesson to be learned from that. Similarly, if we compare the United States to the real world actually existing competitors, Europe, broadly speaking, and China, I think we come off relatively well by comparison. So, it's easy to look in, again, Aquinas or Aristotle or whatever your favorite source is and find a philosophical or literary alternative that looks dramatically better. And you can also look backward in American history and extract a more or less idealized account of a particular moment that you favor. But compared once again to actually existing real world alternatives, I think our approach embodied in certain states and embodied in American institutions really does not come off as badly as the more catastrophic diagnoses suggest.
Can I pick up on something Sam said at the beginning of his answer? Because I think it's a thing I've been thinking a lot about, which is where fusionism went wrong. And part of it, I think, is, as you alluded to, Sam, like mistaking the particular policy implications of fusionism that were relevant in 1984 with the policies that we should necessarily be pursuing today. So I think that the idea of liberty and virtue is the sort of enduring truth, and figuring out how to be true to both those traditions. But the way that should be manifested in policy, and particularly like when it comes to foreign policy, for example, the fusionists of the Cold War era were Cold War hawks. But I don't think that necessarily means, it's a mistake to think that to be a fusionist means you have to be hawkish on foreign policy in all circumstances. And I think that that's part of where the movement kind of went astray after the fall of the Soviet Union, was forgetting that when conditions change, like that means that policy should change as well. Like we should not be going out there looking for dragons to slay, because part of one of the essential characteristics of being a conservative in America is being, a defense hawk. This is not the right way to do it. This is mistaking the policy application for the enduring principle, and also on like tax cuts and things like that as well.
And I would add trade. I mean, the sort of pioneers that we think of were free marketeers, and they were largely, although not entirely, international free traders. But I don't think either of those inclinations tells you what the right way to deal with an extremely large predatory mercantilist power is. And you can read Smith and Hayek and appreciate the virtues of international trade without thinking that it is a great idea to let China into your liberal trading order. And incidentally, if you look back at what they actually said on some of these things, they were the skeptics about engaging in closer trade and economic relations with the Soviet Union, because they recognized the ideological and military threat that it posed. They did not say, well, let's just open the gates and peace and prosperity will follow. So that, I think, is another example where an inclination and goal was mistaken for a particular policy. And that policy was then sort of absolutized as the sole answer for all dilemmas.
Yeah, Wilhelm Röpke in The Humane Economy is dead set against any kind of trade with the Soviet Union for exactly this reason. He doesn't want to help it. Or offer it any opportunities to benefit from American trade. And it's sort of in retrospect what may have happened with China. Charlie, you I was going to ask you about freedom conservatives. I know they came up before. I think it was Slade who brought them up. This seems to be a contemporary effort to restate fusionism, as well as to kind of help people who still hold on to these positions or are interested in them to have opportunities to meet, foster ideas, maybe start publications, have panels, do outreach, organization, stuff like that. So what do you make of it now that it's been a little over a year since it got started?
Well, I think it's quite interesting in that I am one of those people. I think I signed the original statement.
And so did I, yeah.
Yeah. It seems to me that as much as an intellectual exercise, it is a practical exercise that is deemed by the people it's criticizing to be unnecessary, but is in fact necessary. What I mean by that is the right has always had these various constituent parts, and we don't need to go back to 2015 to find a rise in more immigration skeptical, trade skeptical, paleo-conservative sentiment. You can find it in Pat Buchanan in 1992 when he challenged George H.W. Bush for the nomination. The difference is that in recent years, that side of the movement has become more powerful, at least at the elite level. And what has been weird about that is that while it has become more powerful at the elite level, it has been ever louder in insisting that it's not. And that the elites are all people like me who are freedom conservatives. And this is very weird. And I totally understand why in 2015, 2016, all of the rhetoric coming out of that more Buchananite wing of the party was, we have to supplant the Charles Cookes of the world, the National Reviews of the world. Yep. But they did. They did do it. And they haven't ever accepted this. They just cannot cope with the fact that at least at the top of the tower, they're the ones in the seats. And so the freedom conservatism project seems to me, as much as reminding everyone what it is that classical liberals believe, is to say, hey, we're still here. And actually, we're not in charge anymore. So we need to meet and create all of these institutions around us that we used to have by default. Because, as I said, I don't actually think that the NatCon movement has been particularly successful. I don't think it's won the majority of hearts and minds on the right. I don't think it's been particularly electorally successful. I don't even think it's got most of its agenda through. What it has done is it's taken over the levers of power. And the freedom conservative bloc is sitting there saying, we're still here, we still believe this, and if we get the chance, we want to be back in charge of the messaging.
Sam, so your book, After Nationalism, took head on the nationalism that many in national conservatives see as central to the future of the American right. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the critique that you brought in that book, especially since for all the nationalism you see on the new right, there is, as I think everyone's observed, a fair amount of anti-Americanism among it.
Yeah, I mean, so the argument of the book, again, maybe somewhat at odds with the marketing. And here I'm sympathetic to Charlie. The things that you or publishers have to say to promote a book don't always correspond precisely to the contents, is not that nationalism is bad or that it's dead. And on the contrary, I say explicitly that nationalist candidates and movements and parties are likely to remain quite popular for the foreseeable future. What I do challenge is the idea that there was sort of a stable, coherent vision of American national identity that everyone agreed on until last Tuesday. And we can just sort of, if we hector people enough, we'll get back to that. And I think that's wrong on both counts. I mean, I think it's wrong historically, and I try to show that at different times and for different groups, what it means to be American has varied quite a lot. But also, I just don't think that this is something that you can accomplish by yelling at people. And again, what I try to show in the book is that the consolidation of national identity has tended to be a response to a national and international crisis. And it's not coincidental that you get one vision sort of emerging out of independence and the early republic, another vision that's associated with the Civil War, and yet another that emerges from the post-World War II era. And one of the things that I think is happening is that we are getting to the end of the lifespan of the post-World War II construction of American nationalism, and quite literally the lifespan. I mean, World War II is now at the very edge of living memory, but we haven't yet had the real world experiences, not books being published, not speeches on TV, but things happening that could generate a replacement. And I understand why people feel stuck with these arguments and ideas and sort of narratives and symbols that seem outmoded and old-fashioned, but also don't have obvious replacements. So, here, as with the looming fiscal crisis, unfortunately, I think we are just going to have to wait and see what happens rather than attempting to impose our or anyone's correct opinions of what American national identity should look like. I don't think that works particularly well. There have been attempts in the past. In the book, I try to show where and how they've failed. The most you can do, and here I think I'm paraphrasing Milton Friedman, is to be in the right place at the right time. And I suspect that some kind of reckoning is coming, but when exactly it will happen and what it will look like, I don't know.
So if the listeners have learned anything, it's that I don't read the books, just the marketing material. So Slade, we're recording this podcast only a few days after the vice presidential debate, and both the Republican candidate, J.D. Vance, and the Democratic candidate, Tim Walz, agreed on a lot of issues that seem to run contrary to fusionist positions, both present and past, like the expansion of federal entitlements, increasing of taxes like tariffs, and advocacy for the union capture of labor. Is this really the new consensus that fusionists need to confront? It seems to have emerged in both parties.
It's a really important observation. It shows just how different. So this actually gets to your question to Sam about nationalism, because one of my frustrations is when people first started trying to revive the idea of nationalism in the American conservative context, is they would do this sort of bait and switch thing where they would be like, "Do you love America? Like, unless you love, if you're not a nationalist, you must not love America, right?" Like, it's not a word that should be used just to convey like having love for or pride in your country, because that's not the thing that is not a thing that differentiates old school fusionists. Like Reaganite fusionists, they loved America. This was not a thing that was absent on the fusionist right before. So when the new right nationalists of today talk about nationalism, they have to mean something else besides that. And ultimately, when you look a little deeper, you find that they do mean something else. They mean extremely hostile stance toward immigration, toward trade, and a much more, as your question about J.D. Vance and the VP debate gets at, a much more left-wing approach to economic policy more broadly, pro-labor, pro-industrial policy, pro-tariffs, pro-corporate taxes in some cases. It's interesting to see some of the new right sort of wonky types like Orrin Cass pushing for tax policies that Donald Trump has realized are actually not going to fly because the population is not with them, with him on that. And so rejecting those. But anyway, it's just very, very clearly pro-regulation, pro-subsidy, pro-tax, like overall, it's left-wing economics. That's why you saw so much agreement on the stage between J.D. Vance and Tim Walz, is that this is the new right is pushing a sort of leftish to far left. I mean, in some cases, you have like zero daylight between something that an Orrin Cass is advocating and something that an Elizabeth Warren is advocating. They both have come out, for example, for a policy of requiring by law corporations to hand over some large percentage of the seats on their boards to worker representatives. That's an Elizabeth Warren and a Bernie Sanders policy that conservative wonks like Orrin Cass also have said positive things about. So this is a real change in what they're pushing for from what was considered to be quote unquote conservative economics of a generation past. That whether there's an actual consensus or popular support for this is another question. And I think that's gets to the point that Charlie has been making about how, it's kind of interesting that the new right folks do not exactly have a sterling track record of electoral success. So it throws some doubt on this question of whether people actually want there to be two left-wing economic parties or not.
And here again, I think the confrontation with the reality principle rather than arguments about books is really central. So there's a strike now of longshoremen at major ports. We don't know how long it will go on or what the terms of resolution will be. But if the strike continues and if the unions get some of the things that they want, the price of goods is likely to increase. I think that is going to be extremely unpopular if that happens. And I think a political orientation that says you, the consumer, have to pay more for stuff that you want to keep the unions happy is not going to be as successful, and especially not going to be as successful with Republican voters or likely Republican voters as advocates of a friendlier stand toward labor would like to believe.
So just as a final question, since we're starting to hit the hour mark, it's for Charlie. What are some issues that fusionists can use to renew their appeal or cultivate a broader audience, like housing and land use reform, deregulation, higher education reform? What do you think's out there as low-hanging fruit?
I mean, I think all of them, but I think Sam made a key point, which is that very often the enthusiasm for fusionism is the product of misery. And this is because fusionists are broadly of the anti-utopian approach and therefore understand that the lessons of life need to be relearned over and over, and that human beings are going to make the same mistakes in perpetuity. And we do. And we're coming up on the cycle again where we're talking about price controls because we've forgotten that those don't work. That is normal and it is natural. Why is it that you had two vice presidential candidates agreeing on a great deal? Because it's the obvious answer. And I will be careful here because I don't want to say or make it seem as if I'm saying that people who don't agree with me are stupid. That's not what I mean at all. But it is the more obvious answer. And I've often thought that if you put a Milton Friedman type in a debate against an Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez type, the room would end up hating Milton Friedman so much unless things were bad. Because the question would be, how are you going to fix X? And Friedman would say, well, I don't really know, but what I want to do is create the environment or the circumstances or the culture within which someone else can fix X. And the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez would say, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to set up the Department of Fixing X, and I'm going to appropriate money to fix X. And you know, that is just to the average voter who is rationally not particularly interested in politics because they have lives to live. They have marriages to fulfill and children to raise and jobs to do and hobbies to engage and churches to worship it. They're not sitting around thinking about this all the time. That is a much more satisfying and straightforward answer because a lot of life actually does work like that, but politics doesn't. And until you get to the point at which you can say, look at what we just did by spending $2 trillion we didn't have. That's why eggs are now $8. Then you've got your work cut out. So I mean, I think that it's not for a lack of intellectual energy or effort, right, on the part of fusionists. They're not lazy. Yes, sometimes they can get a bit stuck in the past and confuse instincts for policies, but generally speaking, they're not lazy. But we are just waiting for the bad ideas to fail, which they have to do every now and again. And I think that's the key condition.
It's like bad times lead to good politics lead to bad lead to good times, which lead to bad politics.
Exactly.
Is this the rise of based Slade?
Can I say something about Michael Novak that may or may not be relevant?
Of course.
I think it links up some of the things that Stephanie and Charlie have mentioned, because of course one of the central concepts in the response to fusionism or the criticism of fusionism from the right is the common good. We need to act to secure the common good and not leave it to markets or businesses or other self-interested actors to determine. And Novak, who's another one of these figures who gets a lot of heat these days, has an interesting remark on this. He says, at a certain level of abstraction, it's easy to define the common good. We all want high employment and high wages and also low prices. And we want easy travel, but protection for domestic industry and, on and on and on. But the problem, he says, is you can't have all of those things at the same time. And the limitation of the common good as a political concept is that it's not particularly helpful in dealing with trade-offs. One of the intellectual advantages, which is unfortunately a political disadvantage in the fusionist tradition, is that it requires confrontation with trade-offs. And it suggests, and this gets to Stephanie's original definition, that ultimately the best judges of those trade-offs are the people who are immediately concerned, who can decide, I would rather pay more for a domestically produced product than an imported one, or whatever the decision happens to be. The demand for solutions is not just a demand for someone else to figure out the problem because our lives are busy and we want to deal with other things. It's also a demand or a hope that trade-offs can be made to disappear. And the anti-utopian element that Charlie identified as being central is ultimately just a reminder that the trade-offs never disappear. You can't have all the good things you want at the same time. And to the extent that fusionism involves a serious discussion about how to manage those trade-offs within the context of constitutional government, representative institutions, and the rule of law, then it is not the answer to the problems, but it is an approach to finding an answer. And what that looks like at any given time on any given issue can't really be fixed in advance.
Slade, Charlie, Sam, thank you so much for appearing on the Law and Liberty podcast. I wish we could go longer, but you have lives to live. And so
I don't. Other people may. I have nothing else to do.
Well, in any case, I think we should close here. Thank you so much for all of you for appearing on the Law and Liberty podcast.
Thank you,
James.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Law and Liberty Podcast. Be sure to subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and visit us online at www.lawliberty.org.